Brooklyn Hayes, a black woman, seemed far too noticeable the moment she walked into the luxury jewelry store. Her skin color and modest clothing were all it took for a racist police officer and a white customer to accuse her of theft in broad daylight. What they didn't know was that the woman they just targeted was the highest-ranking SWAT commander in the entire state, and by letting prejudice lead the way, they were about to walk straight into a confrontation with the truth they never saw coming. What happens when the very person they dismissed forces the system to confront itself? Write a comment where you're watching and stay tuned to the end and see the satisfying ending for the racists. The gray SUV came to a stop in front of a high-end jewelry store on the corner of 7th and Lexington, where polished glass windows reflected the late afternoon sun like a glossy shell over a world that, underneath, was cold and detached. Brooklyn Hayes stepped out of the vehicle, carrying a small black leather purse. Her outfit was simple yet presentable: dark jeans, a fitted t-shirt, and a charcoal gray hoodie with no visible branding. Her hair was pulled into a neat low bun at the nape of her neck, and her clean ankle boots gave her walk a sense of both ease and purpose. She wore little makeup, but her face carried a quiet strength, one shaped by discipline and precision. Inside the store, the space gleamed with white light, so pristine it bordered on sterile. Thick glass display cases showcased gemstone bracelets and slender gold necklaces, each piece glinting under the perfect lighting. At the far end of the store, a metal-plated logo marked the brand's legacy: Marlowe and Finn, 1921. Every detail radiated elegance, but also distance. Brooklyn walked slowly, her eyes passing over a few platinum rings before settling on a simple necklace with an amethyst pendant. A faint smile touched her lips as she thought of the aunt who had raised her, who had just recovered from a long, grueling round of chemotherapy. This would be a gift to say, "Thank you for still being here." That was all she wanted. The quiet was so complete that the rhythm of her boots against the white stone floor seemed unnaturally loud. Aside from a slightly uneasy-looking staff member behind the register and a white woman in an evening gown browsing necklaces to the right, there was only one other person in the room: a police officer. He stood leaning against a column near the entrance, holding a disposable coffee cup, his gaze unfocused yet somehow aware of everything. Brooklyn glanced at him briefly, then continued toward the jewelry display. She had no reason to feel uneasy. She hadn't done anything wrong. Still, something in the way he looked at her made her pause, just for a moment, not out of fear, but instinct, the kind that had once saved her in situations where a wrong glance could lead to bloodshed. The white woman, mid-40s, softly curled blonde hair, designer sunglasses perched on her head, let out a quiet chuckle when she met Brooklyn's eyes, a smile as thin as a razor gone so quickly it might not have happened at all. She resumed chatting softly with the store clerk, though her gaze continued to flick toward Brooklyn with the mechanical precision of a stopwatch. The store was no longer quiet in a peaceful way. It was silent in that odd, expectant way, like something was about to happen. Brooklyn could feel it, a creeping pressure sliding in from the corners of the room. No one said a word, yet she could feel it, the scrutiny, the silent judgment, seeping in like cold air through a crack in the wall. She straightened her posture, her fingers still lightly holding the necklace, and looked up, searching for an employee to ask the price. But the man behind the counter only blinked at her, then quickly looked down as if suddenly busy with something below the register. The blonde woman gave another soft laugh, this time glancing toward the officer by the door. Brooklyn followed the glance and found the cop's eyes locked on her, sharp now as if something in him had just clicked. Brooklyn tightened her grip on the purse, swallowing back the sigh rising in her throat. She didn't want to leave. That would feel like admitting to something she hadn't done. But staying suddenly felt like stepping onto a stage where someone had already written her role, and she'd never agreed to play it. Brooklyn stood still for a moment in front of the display case, her eyes fixed on the amethyst necklace. The white overhead lights poured down onto the glass, making the stone shimmer softly, like a splash of violet ink bleeding into paper. She was about to ask for the price, but the store clerk behind the counter had already turned away, bending over the ledger as if he hadn't heard a thing. Brooklyn glanced around, and her gaze met Lori Whitmore's, the white woman in the evening dress standing a short distance away, and a kind of hush like morning fog began to creep into the room. She knew this atmosphere well. It was the kind that no one named, but it always hung in the air whenever a black person, no matter how neatly dressed, no matter how composed, entered a space where cultural bias had silently decided they didn't belong. A luxury jewelry store in a wealthy neighborhood where everything gleamed and stayed quiet only amplified her presence and made her easier to define, to reduce. Travis Beck, the white police officer near the entrance, had noticed her from the moment she walked in. He didn't move, didn't show anything obvious, but Brooklyn could still feel his gaze clinging to her, not watching, but judging. It was the same kind of look she remembered from childhood, following her and her aunt around grocery stores with a silent security guard never far behind, as if every step taken by two black women might be the start of something criminal. Brooklyn exhaled quietly, her hand still resting on the glass. She shifted slightly to the right where another store clerk was adjusting a jewelry tray. "Excuse me, can you tell me how much this one is?" Her voice was low, steady, clear, carrying no hesitation. But the employee only looked up for the briefest moment before ducking down again, as if something urgent in the drawer demanded his full attention. No answer, no eye contact, no intent to help. A small pause stretched between those tiny, thoughtless movements, and somehow it made Brooklyn feel like she'd dropped something on the floor, even though she hadn't moved at all. She heard heels clicking behind her. A strong, perfumed scent followed, one that belonged to people who weren't used to waiting. Lori Whitmore approached the display, her steps slow and deliberate, but her eyes never left Brooklyn. It wasn't quite hostility, but something territorial, like a woman standing in her living room, discovering a stranger who hadn't been invited. Brooklyn didn't turn around, but she could imagine that look perfectly. And then, just as she expected, a voice rose behind her, quiet enough to seem discreet, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Officer, I'm not sure, but I think I saw her put something in her pocket." Travis Beck turned toward Lori. He didn't act surprised. He didn't ask, "Are you sure?" He just gave a slight nod. Nothing more was needed. A whisper from a well-dressed white woman was more than enough to shift suspicion toward Brooklyn, as if by reflex, as if it had been trained into him. Brooklyn tilted her head, eyes lifting toward the display case ceiling, where a small security camera was fixed in the middle of the room. The overhead light reflected in her eyes, making her squint slightly, not because of the brightness, but because alertness had started to harden into tension. She didn't say a word. Her right hand rested near the zipper of her hoodie, her left pressed lightly against the counter. She could feel Travis starting to move, each footstep deliberate, the sound of his shoes against the stone floor, so soft yet so sharp it made her inner ear twitch. She knew that sound. It was like wind before a storm. Behind the glass, the store clerk still kept his head low, but his eyes had begun sneaking glances through the gap. Lori had stepped back slightly, arms crossed, gaze fixed, like she was waiting for a scene to play out exactly the way she'd scripted it in her mind. Travis was now only 2 steps away. He didn't speak, as if testing what she would do. Brooklyn looked up and met his eyes, not defiant, not afraid, just firm, steady. Then the officer set his coffee cup on the small table by the door, adjusted his belt, and began walking toward her. The show was about to begin, one she never auditioned for. Travis stepped forward, placing himself between Brooklyn and the display case. His posture was upright, and his expression tried to stay neutral, but there was a tightening behind his eyes. He rested a hand on his belt, thumb hooked casually around the loop, the stance of an officer about to handle a situation. The store remained brightly lit and quiet, but the atmosphere had shifted. It no longer carried the elegance of a luxury shop. It was thick now, like the moment before something snapped. "Return what you took, right now," The words landed with the weight of a verdict, delivered without trial, without question. Brooklyn froze, not out of fear, but at the audacity of the demand. Her brow furrowed slightly, as if replaying his words in her head to make sure she'd heard him right. "What I took," she repeated, each word deliberate, slow, and clear, giving him one last chance to reconsider what he had just said. Travis didn't respond. He stepped back half a pace, watching her, as though waiting for her to reach into her pocket, to do something suspicious, something that would retroactively justify the entire scene Lori had started to script. And just like that, Lori took a step forward, positioning herself just behind Travis's left shoulder, her voice suddenly urgent and certain, like a reliable witness delivering the truth. "I saw it. When she leaned over the counter, she pushed something into her pocket. No mistake." Brooklyn turned fully to face them, her gaze shifting from Lori to Travis, then resting on the officer, this time with a calm, skeptical stare. "You're choosing to believe her over me, without a shred of evidence?" Travis said nothing. Instead, he extended his hand toward her hoodie pocket, gesturing. "Open your pocket, right now." The command wasn't loud, but it carried the shameless authority of a system that had long acted as if people like her had no right to doubt, no right to demand respect. Brooklyn didn't move. She stayed rooted, eyes fixed on Travis's face. "I refuse, and I request to speak with the store manager." The words dropped like a stone into still water. Lori let out a short, sharp laugh, half scorn, half disbelief. "Oh, please. You're still talking about your rights? What do you think this is, a civics class?" Brooklyn tilted her head slightly, a flicker of cold steel flashing in her eyes. But instead of answering Lori, she inhaled slowly, steadying herself, and looked toward the register, where the store clerk still stood frozen, as he'd melted into the glass itself. "You work here? I'm requesting to speak to your manager." No reply. The man behind the counter pressed his lips into a line and lowered his head a bit more, as if trying to disappear by a few more centimeters. Feeling the indifference harden behind her, Brooklyn turned back, eyes now locked on Travis. Her voice was even, unfaltering. "I've done nothing wrong. I asked for the price of a necklace. I didn't steal anything. I haven't broken a single law, and I do not consent to a search based on an accusation without proof." Travis raised an eyebrow and nodded slightly, as if he'd been waiting for that line. To escalate it, he stepped closer, now just inches away. She could see the pores on his cheek and hear the shift in his tone. "So you're refusing to cooperate with a police officer in the line of duty?" It wasn't a real question. It was bait, and Brooklyn knew it. Off to the side, Lori took a small step back, not out of shame, but calculation. She was creating just enough distance to avoid involvement if things got messy, while still preserving her role as the credible witness. Brooklyn didn't break eye contact with Travis. "I'm not refusing to cooperate. I'm asking you to follow the proper procedure. I have a right to ask for evidence before being treated like a criminal." She stepped to her right, a subtle move to avoid the invisible enclosure they were building around her. But Travis matched her movement, blocking the path again. He didn't raise a hand, didn't reach for cuffs, but his presence, his stare, was enough to turn the tension up another degree. A second store employee emerged from the back, eyes still adjusting, then immediately froze at the sight of the standoff. His gaze darted between Travis, Lori, and Brooklyn. For a split second, something like concern flickered across his face, but then his eyes dropped, as if he too had decided to choose the path of least resistance. Brooklyn didn't flinch. She held her ground. She knew, if she gave in here, if she allowed them to unzip her pocket like she had something to hide, then their story would become true, no matter the facts. And that wouldn't just be a personal humiliation, it would be another link in a long chain of moments where Black people in America were forced to hold their breath, where no evidence was needed, only a glance and a label. She could see them, those before her, forced to prove their innocence when no crime had ever been committed. And she knew if she stayed silent today, there'd just be one more person walking the world with the weight of always being suspected. Because of the color of their skin, in the silence that felt frozen in time, Travis reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder. He pressed the button, with the kind of decisiveness that suggested he'd been waiting all along to do exactly this. His voice came through clear and steady, not angry, just firm enough to turn fiction into fact. "Dispatch, this is Beck at Marlowe and Finn, 122 Lexington. We've got a female suspect attempting theft, refusing to cooperate with police, showing signs of resistance." Brooklyn didn't move. Her eyes followed every word he spoke as if they were blades, each syllable slicing slowly through the dignity she had spent years building. Not because she was unfamiliar with this kind of accusation, but because every time it cut deeper. She could hear those words echoing in the air: suspect, theft, resisting, labels printed in advance, made to stick to people who looked like her, no matter what they did, no matter who they were. No one asked if there was proof. No one wondered if there was a camera, a recording, a reason, because when those words were spoken by a white officer, they didn't need verification. They became truth. To the right, Lori Whitmore pulled out her phone, not to call for help, not to gather facts, but to live stream. Her fingers danced across the screen with a familiarity that hinted she'd done this before. And then, as if this was the moment she'd been waiting for all day, her voice filled the charged air. "Everyone take a look. This is the type. Always acting all normal, and the moment you turn your back, they steal. Don't let the looks fool you." Brooklyn turned her head toward the phone's lens. No panic, no fight, but no avoidance either. Just a direct stare, sharp but tired, as if she were silently asking, "Is this the society you're all so proud of?" The cashier looked nervously toward the back, where the second employee still stood by the stockroom door. Their eyes met briefly, but neither spoke. A young customer who had just stepped inside stopped, mid-step, unsure whether to proceed or walk right back out. No one said a word. No one intervened. Travis remained still, radio in hand, face unreadable, as if he'd just completed another piece of routine paperwork. And then the glass door opened again. The soft chime rang out once more, but this time no one noticed it, because the moment she stepped in, the entire room shifted. The air pulled tight, and then stillness. A black woman walked in, her hair pulled into a high bun, a crisp buttoned shirt tucked under a navy blazer. Her steps were light but grounded, her heels tapping rhythmically against the marble floor, not rushed, but with a gravity that commanded attention. One by one, heads turned toward her, whether they meant to or not. Her eyes swept the room like a lens, trained by years of experience, trained to read scenes, people, and power. And in mere seconds, she understood the entire play unfolding in front of her. No one told her what was happening. They didn't have to. It was all there, in the body language, in the tension, in the silence soaked with expectation for a righteous ending to prejudice. It was as if she could hear what hadn't been said, as if every breath held back, every look shifted away in fear, every attempt to ignore the truth. None of it escaped her gaze. She stopped in the open space between the display case and the entrance, the exact center of the room, where no one could turn their back, and she looked directly at Travis, the man still trying to balance authority on a scale that had already tipped beneath him. Then she spoke, calm, clear, and measured, not loud, but with the weight of someone who only speaks when it truly matters. "Do you know who she is?" The question wasn't shouted, but it shattered something, like a pane of glass cracked from the inside. Lori lowered her phone in an instant. The cashier flinched, and for the first time since this began, Travis hesitated. "Ask again, do you know who she is?" Travis pressed his lips together. He didn't answer. He looked like he was digging through memory, but the hesitation gave him away. If he knew, he wouldn't need time to think. Brooklyn turned to face the woman who had just entered. Her lips parted slightly, as if releasing a breath she'd been holding since the beginning. The woman was Deanna Corbin, a name that required no introduction in their world. But she didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She stood there like a fact that the system hadn't accounted for. Travis began to sense something was off. He glanced at Lori, who had now stopped recording and was quietly slipping her phone back into her purse, suddenly awkward and unsure. The tone of the room shifted. It no longer felt like control. It felt like the ground was starting to split open beneath them. Diana didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence alone made the radio and Travis's hand feel heavier by the second. Brooklyn didn't speak either. She just looked at Diana and gave a small nod. Not a greeting, but a signal, a confirmation. She was ready for the truth to come out. The system, built on assumption, had just begun to shake, and this was only the beginning. Diana's question dropped into the room like a cold gust of wind, sweeping through an air already frozen by prejudice. Travis Beck, who had stood stolid as stone in front of Brooklyn moments before, was now holding himself too upright, as if his posture alone could compensate for the uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "I'm guessing you don't know who she is," Diana said, her voice steady, unchanged, "which explains this careless decision you just made." Travis swallowed hard, the dry sound echoing like something caught in his throat. He glanced at Brooklyn, his gaze flickering, searching for a way out he was unprepared for. But Brooklyn stood still, her eyes calm, carrying the quiet composure of someone who had seen this scene unfold more times than he could imagine. Diana took a step forward, her eyes never leaving his. "She's the state commander of the SWAT unit, Captain Brooklyn Hayes." A ripple of murmurs rose from the two store employees. One of them inhaled sharply as if doused in cold water. Lori, now backed almost flush against the display counter, wore a face stiff with makeup, and suddenly even that makeup couldn't hide how frozen she'd become. She said nothing, only grimaced slightly, as though trying to process what she had just done, but not a single word of apology followed. Diana continued, and this time her words weren't just for Travis. They were for everyone in the room. "She has led more than 20 high-risk operations across this state. Missions none of you would dare imagine yourselves stepping into. She led them." Travis dipped his head for a second, then quickly raised it again, trying to project control. But his hands clenched stiffly by his sides, and a bead of sweat traced a slow path down his temple. Brooklyn still hadn't spoken. She stepped forward, just one step, her gaze sweeping across the room, pausing on each stunned face, before stopping in front of the same glass counter where she'd first asked the price of a necklace. She reached into the front pocket of her hoodie and pulled out a slim black leather wallet. She unzipped it slowly, gently, as if opening a book, and then slid out a small metallic badge. Her credentials. She laid the badge on the glass. The soft clink of metal meeting glass wasn't loud, but it rang through the room like a bell striking directly at the arrogance of assumptions that had just ruled this space. The light above caught the gold emblem and cast its reflection onto Lori's face. The white woman blinked and lowered her gaze as if the shine itself was too much to bear. But it wasn't brightness that burned. It was truth, and it refused to be ignored. Silence held the room in a tight grip. No one moved, no one spoke, and no one could maintain the same confidence they wore when Brooklyn first stepped inside. Because now every eye was forced to recalibrate, not just how they saw Brooklyn Hayes, but how they saw everyone who didn't look like someone in charge. In American culture, the cruelest part isn't the insult screamed aloud. It's the quiet assumption that a black woman in a hoodie can't possibly be a commander, that someone shopping for jewelry with brown skin couldn't possibly be the one giving orders to a state-level tactical team. They don't say it out loud, but they live it and act on it, and only when the truth becomes undeniable do they show fear. Not because they regret being wrong, but because they fear they were wrong about someone who matters. Diana looked around the room slowly. "You radioed in that she was a non-compliant suspect?" she asked. Travis said nothing. Another bead of sweat slid down his neck, and this time his shoulders slumped slightly, as though absorbing a blow he hadn't seen coming. Brooklyn still hadn't moved, but her gaze shifted to the cashier, the first person who had looked away when she asked for the price. He met her eyes briefly, then quickly dropped his head, fingers fumbling with a drawer that didn't need opening. A new customer walked through the door and froze, caught mid-step in a scene he didn't fully understand, but instinctively recognized. A black woman standing still, badge on the counter. A white officer is silent and pale, and a room dense, not with wealth, but with shame. He didn't need to ask. The look on his face made it clear. He understood exactly what was happening and who was being wronged. Finally, Brooklyn spoke. Her voice wasn't loud or angry, but it struck directly into the minds of everyone still clinging to their biases. If I didn't have this badge, if I were just a young woman walking in here in this same hoodie, without any title to my name, would you have taken me away, put me in handcuffs because of someone's word? No one answered, because everyone knew the answer had been decided long before the question was asked, and in that silence there was the clearest proof of all. A system still far too comfortable making decisions based on skin, not truth. Silence still hung over the store like a dense fog. The overhead lights continued to shine, but no one paid attention to the gleam of the jewelry behind the glass anymore. Lori remained backed into a corner, clutching the strap of her purse as if trying to hold on to the last scraps of her pride. Travis stood exactly where he had been, but the squared stance he once held with arrogant certainty was now faltering, like the weight of truth had settled onto his shoulders and was pressing down on the back of his neck. And then, just as the tension seemed to settle into stillness, a memory surfaced, one Brooklyn never expected to face again, especially not on a day like this, in a moment like this. It wasn't the sting of what had just happened that triggered it. It was his face. That face, which she had once seen through a haze of smoke and flashing emergency lights on a night drenched in sweat and gunfire more than 6 years ago. Brooklyn stared at Travis, slowly peeling back the layers of time until recognition took shape. It came back clearly now. A SWAT operation in the Southeast District, one of the first she led as a newly appointed commander. There had been a rookie assigned to the tactical team, tall, broad-shouldered, but jumpy, uncoordinated. In the midst of a hostage extraction, he panicked and fired prematurely, throwing off the team's strategy and causing a fellow officer to be seriously wounded. The squad had scrambled to regain control in chaos, and Brooklyn, though she had every right to file for disciplinary action, chose instead to give him a second chance. She remembered exactly why. Because he was young, because she believed people could grow, and because she thought forgiveness could sometimes be the lesson that truly sticks. That rookie was Travis Beck. Brooklyn blinked. She didn't know if Travis recognized her. Maybe, to him back then, she had just been another recently promoted black commander, someone not memorable enough, not in place enough to deserve a permanent space in his memory. But for her, that decision had stayed. It was one of those quiet reminders she carried, the kind that tells you mercy is a gamble, and not every act of grace comes with gratitude in return. And now, standing here, watching the man she once protected turn around and wield power against her, not because of rank but because of race, Brooklyn saw with brutal clarity. Some people, when they learn nothing from their past mistakes, will simply use your forgiveness as a stepping stone into deeper cowardice. She wasn't angry. The sting of being suspected, followed, misnamed, and forced to prove her worth had long since calloused over. But this time, it wasn't humiliation that chilled her to the bone. It was betrayal, not by the system, but by a man who had once stood under her command. She stepped forward until she was standing directly in front of Travis, her gaze sharp in a way he had never seen before. "You don't recognize me?" Travis flinched slightly. He looked at her again, this time closer, like a man slowly waking up from a delusion of his own making. Brooklyn gave a faint nod. "Eden Street operation, 2017. I led your squad." A long blink, a breath caught in Travis's throat, barely making it out. He straightened slightly, but the stance he took now wasn't one of control. It was the stiff posture of someone realizing they'd made a mistake that couldn't be undone. I didn't file the report. I rewrote it so it wouldn't ruin your record. I gave you a second chance. And this is what you did with it? Brooklyn didn't wait for a response. She knew the kind of man who never said thank you, only waited for the moment he could use power to reaffirm a self-respect built on entitlement. The kind of man raised inside a system where a black person's forgiveness was seen as weakness and their silence was mistaken for consent. Diana stood silently nearby, watching. No one in the store moved. Because they now understood this wasn't just a confrontation, it was the unmasking of a sick cycle. A white man, once spared by grace, now using authority to crush the very person who shielded him. Brooklyn looked down, picked up her badge, and slid it back into the front pocket of her hoodie. When she lifted her head, there was no pain left in her eyes, only the resolve of someone who had finally stopped hoping their mercy would be enough to teach others justice. "I don't forgive a second time," she said. The words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of something unforgettable, something that would echo in the minds of everyone present long after the room had emptied. The glass door hadn't even fully closed behind the last customer when the sharp, deliberate sound of boots echoed from the hallway outside. No face was needed. Just the rhythm of that stride was enough to tell that whoever was approaching wasn't someone to be ignored. When the figure of a large man in a deep blue uniform appeared in the doorway, the entire store seemed to snap into alignment, as if gravity had suddenly shifted. That man was Captain Mason Ricks, Regional Commander, a name every officer in the state knew. He wasn't someone who showed up often, and certainly not the kind of man who responded to petty calls. Yet here he was, stepping into a jewelry store in the middle of the workday, his face as cold as steel, his dark eyes scanning each person in the room like a sentence not yet spoken. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need a briefing. One look exchanged with Diana was enough to tell him everything. And when his gaze landed on Travis Beck, still frozen, hand hovering near his belt, his face as rigid as stone, the tension in the room became so thick you could hear a pin drop. "Travis Beck." Mason's voice boomed like distant thunder across a clear sky. "Remove your badge and hand over your weapon. Now." There was no explanation, no room for excuses. His command wasn't a formality. It was the final judgment on a string of choices that had gone too far, in a system already splintered from carrying too much silence for too long. Travis didn't move. He looked around, searching for something, an ally, a reason, maybe even a flicker of mercy from Brooklyn. But no one spoke. No one stepped in to save him from the fall he had dug for himself. And Brooklyn, the one who had been insulted, accused, and humiliated, remained where she was, saying nothing, issuing no threats, making no demands. Her presence, her name, her rank, those were more than enough now. The system had no choice but to respond. "Remove your badge," Mason repeated, his tone lower, heavier. When he took a single step forward, Travis instinctively stepped half a pace back, his hand trembling as he reached up to unclip the badge from his chest. The sound of the metal release was chilling. Then came the faint thud of the firearm placed gently on the glass counter. The same counter where, just moments earlier, Travis had blocked Brooklyn's path like a gatekeeper of justice. Now, he was the one being stripped of authority, not by force, but because he had allowed his prejudice to override the law he claimed to uphold. Mason collected both items, not with rage, but with the firm decisiveness of someone who knew that if a system does not cleanse itself, it will rot from the inside. He handed them to Deanna, then turned to Travis and spoke in a voice not loud, but so clear it could be heard even by someone standing just outside the door. "If she wanted to, you'd have been on the floor 2 minutes ago." It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. Brooklyn had chosen not to act, not to escalate, not to turn this place into a battleground, and that restraint was what made Travis tremble. She had the power, she had the authority, but she didn't need to use it, because at this moment, true justice didn't need to be shouted, it needed to be enforced. Lori Whitmore still stood near the back, silent the entire time. She adjusted her purse, smoothed her sleeve, and turned as if ready to walk out. But it was her eyes, the way they stayed cold, proud, untouched by truth, that revealed everything. She wasn't shaken by what she had witnessed, only annoyed that she'd lost control. That tilt of the chin, that slight curl of the lip, it all said the same thing. She still believed this was just a small incident, something that would pass, something forgettable. Brooklyn didn't look at her again. Lori was no longer worth debating with. She had become a symbol of that particular kind of American, the kind who only fears being wrong when they're caught, and only regrets it when it threatens their sense of power. Mason looked at Brooklyn. He didn't apologize to Travis. He didn't need to explain. His eyes, filled with respect, were enough to say it all. The system, at least at this moment, still had people willing to do what was right. "I'll take it from here," he said. Brooklyn gave a small nod, then stepped back toward the glass counter, the same one where her badge had once sat like a quiet declaration. She didn't need to do anything else. She didn't need to say another word, because what had just happened, Travis removing his badge, placing his weapon in front of her, was the clearest apology the system could offer. And as Mason turned and walked away, taking with him the weight of righteous accountability, leaving Travis behind, disarmed, dishonored, alone, everyone watching felt something rise in their chest. Not satisfaction born of vengeance, but a rare, burning sense of justice fulfilled. In a world so used to injustice, sometimes the greatest relief is simply watching power bow before the truth. Not long after Mason Ricks left, carrying with him the weight of a system finally peeling off its decaying skin, Diana Corbin turned to the man behind the counter. Her voice was even, but there was no mistaking the seriousness in her tone. "This store has internal surveillance, correct?" The clerk jolted slightly, blinking as if he'd just remembered he existed in this room. He nodded rapidly. "Yes, the entire floor is covered, every display has its camera, the control room's in the back." Diana nodded, then exchanged a glance with Brooklyn. Without a word, they walked side by side toward the employee entrance, passing Lori, who now stood silently pressed against the wall near the exit. No one told her to move. She already knew her voice had no place here anymore. Inside the small control room, the cold blue light from the monitors cast a sterile glow across their faces, shifting the mood to something clinical and exact, like the kind of silence found only in operating rooms or courtrooms, where the truth is about to cut through everything. A young technician, visibly tense, pulled up the footage from the time Brooklyn entered the store. The screen showed a ceiling camera's angle, clear, crisp, undeniable. It captured the exact moment she stepped inside, the way she moved toward the display, how she looked at the jewelry, touched a single amethyst necklace, and placed it back in its original position. There were no hidden gestures, no secretive moves, nothing remotely questionable. The air grew dense, heavy with the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for interpretation. Diana leaned against the edge of the desk, her eyes fixed on the screen. Brooklyn remained still, hands loosely clasped in front of her, watching the footage like a detached observer, as if reviewing a documentary about someone else, though the woman on screen was herself. But what made the room fall completely silent wasn't just Brooklyn's obvious innocence. It was the clips that followed, footage from other shifts, other days, showing Travis Beck behaving in eerily similar ways toward other people of color. A young black woman is being questioned for looking at the display case too long. A teenage boy asked for his ID simply for standing near the exit without a bag. An older man was escorted out for making customers uncomfortable. None of them raised their voice. None resisted. Yet each one had been treated like they were trespassing on the edge of criminality. Every action is captured on camera. Every interaction shows the same pattern, and in all of them, Travis was the one who initiated. His face appeared in every frame, stone-cold, self-assured, almost smug. As if wearing a badge gave him the right to redefine suspicion itself. Deanna's jaw clenched slightly. She didn't need to say it aloud. Her expression said enough. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't impulsive. This was a pattern, a repeated behavior, a deliberate tactic. Brooklyn didn't look away from the screen, even after everything she'd witnessed in her career, even after seeing how racism could take shape in so many subtle and overt forms. Watching footage like this still sent a chill through her spine, not out of shock, but familiarity. She'd met men like Travis before, men who lacked the competence to truly lead and so chose to assert themselves by dominating those they believed were beneath them, men who were hollow on the inside and filled that void with shows of force. Because the truth is this, people who know their worth don't need to intimidate anyone. Only those unsure of who they are resort to power plays to force others to bow. Diana instructed the technician to secure all footage, copy it to a separate drive, and lock access. Her voice was measured, angry, but composed. We'll forward this to Internal Affairs. I also want the full record of Travis's conduct in this store. The technician nodded quickly, his face caught between confusion and fear. Maybe this wasn't the first time he'd seen something like this, but it was certainly the first time someone had come to finish what others always left behind. When they stepped out of the control room, the brightness of the store struck their eyes like a fresh start. Brooklyn led Diana at her side. Neither needed to say a word. But as they returned to the same space where Travis once stood projecting control, and where Lori once live-streamed with smug certainty as if she were exposing a typical thief, it all now felt small, almost absurd. Lori was gone, slipped out at some point when no one was watching, but her presence still lingered like a faint residue on the air. Brooklyn glanced toward the spot where she'd stood. There was no hatred in her gaze, just a farewell, a quiet final goodbye to a kind of person she did not need to confront again. The air outside the control room hadn't yet shaken off the tension to return to the polished elegance of a luxury jewelry store. Though Lori had left, Travis had been stripped of duty, and the cameras had shown everything with uncompromising clarity. The weight of the truths exposed still lingered, heavily, uncomfortably, in the minds of everyone who remained. Eyes that once looked away now began to turn back toward Brooklyn, with a new kind of gaze, one mixed with unease, quiet respect, and a deep simmering shame. But Brooklyn, or perhaps she did, she just no longer cared. She had lived far too long beneath those stares to let them matter anymore. As she turned to leave the display area, a voice, hoarse, hesitant, and cracked with age, rose from the far end of the staff hallway. "Miss Hayes?" She stopped. That voice wasn't like any she had heard that day. It carried the weight of years spent in silence, and something in its tremble pulled her back around. A woman stepped slowly into the light, older, dressed in a beige custodial uniform. Her silver hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her sun-weathered face was etched with the kind of lines that come from seeing too much and being asked too little. Her name was Mirta Jean, the store's cleaning staff, a shadow no one ever stopped to notice, a fixture to be passed by, as invisible as the tiles she scrubbed each morning. She walked slowly, achingly so, until she stood just a few paces in front of Brooklyn. And then, to the shock of everyone present, she lowered herself to her knees. No one moved in time to stop her. Diana stepped forward instinctively, but Brooklyn raised a hand, gently shaking her head. She looked down, not with superiority but with genuine respect. Mirta's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her head bowed, but her voice, when it rose, had shed its fear. It burned with something deeper, raw and buried for too long. "I'm sorry to do this," she said, but I can't walk out of here today without telling you something I've kept quiet for years." Brooklyn leaned in slightly, her tone low and soft. "You don't have to kneel, Mrs. Jean." But Myrta shook her head. "I'm not kneeling for you. I'm kneeling for my daughter." The room froze. 3 years ago," she continued, my daughter, was humiliated by a police officer in the middle of the street. She was only 17, in her school uniform, walking home late through a fancy neighborhood. He stopped her, made her face the wall, yelled at her, and called her garbage in front of everyone. Her voice didn't waver anymore. It cut through the silence like steel. That officer was Travis Beck. No one spoke. Deanna's fists clenched, and Brooklyn stood as still as stone, the full weight of the moment pressing down not just on her shoulders, but on everyone in the room. My daughter never told the whole story. She was scared. She was ashamed. She thought she had disgraced the family, and a few months later, she took pills. The breath caught in Myrta's throat. Internal Affairs said there was no evidence. People told me to be quiet, that stirring things up wouldn't help. We were just working immigrants. No papers, no lawyer, no one stands for us. Brooklyn slowly lowered herself, kneeling before the older woman, her hand gently resting over Myrta's trembling fingers. Myrta looked up. Her eyes were red but dry. She had cried enough for one lifetime. Her voice now held only a plea, raw and sacred. "I have nothing to give you, but I'll do anything. I'll clean for you the rest of my life. I'll sell my house. If you need my life to get justice for my child, I'll give it." Brooklyn didn't answer right away. No one could remain neutral anymore. The sterile rituals of procedure had long since collapsed. This was no longer a dispute between an officer and a wronged woman. It was an open wound, carved by a system that had allowed people like Travis Beck to operate unchecked, a system that left women like Myrta Jean to pay the highest price in silence, losing a child to shame no one dared to name. Finally, Brooklyn gripped Myrta's hand tighter. "I don't need your life," she said, her voice low and solid, unshaken. "I need your story. I need you to tell it, all of it, from the beginning, and I will make sure this time no one gets to bury it." Myrta looked at her, lips pressed tight, then nodded, slowly, as if releasing a rope that had been strangling her for years. As the two women stood together, for the first time that day, Brooklyn no longer felt like she had to suppress the fire in her chest. It wasn't just rage anymore. It was purpose, a light not to be dimmed, but to be used, to illuminate every dark corner where silence had allowed injustice to hide, not just for her, but for every voice that had once been told it didn't matter enough to be heard less. Then 48 hours after the incident at Marlowe and Finn, Brooklyn received an email from Internal Affairs. The subject line was blunt. "Urgent response requested regarding complaint from Officer Travis Beck." No pleasantries, no apology for what she had endured, just a summons, framed as if she were the one who needed to explain herself, not the man who had publicly accused her of theft in broad daylight. Travis Beck, it turned out, had wasted no time. He'd retained an internal department attorney, a man known as the shield wall for officers under misconduct scrutiny, infamous for defending those who clung to their badge by hiding behind a procedure. The argument he submitted was brazen, that Brooklyn Hayes had damaged the image of the department, disrespected an officer in the line of duty, and incited public backlash against the institution through public criticism of a colleague whose actions had not yet been formally reviewed. Absurd. But Brooklyn wasn't surprised. She had seen this system operate long enough to know that when a person of color dares to stand up, the retaliation won't just come from the individual who wronged them. It will come from the entire mechanism built to protect that individual. Travis's suspension had been nothing more than a PR maneuver, a bandage for public outrage. The root, the architecture of protectionism that allowed these men to thrive, was still there, waiting, turning its gears. preparing to twist the narrative, bend the rules, and quietly reshape the victim into the problem. This time, the system was striking back. Diana called to tell her that she, too, along with Captain Mason Ricks, had been summoned by Internal Affairs. Their charges were milder on paper: procedural violations during incident response and potential damage to departmental integrity, but the message was the same. You crossed a line, now we reel you back. Diana laughed dryly when she called. I saw this coming. If we act, it's an abuse of power. If we stay silent, it's neglect. Whatever, we stand up anyway. At least you're not alone. Mason didn't call, but Brooklyn knew he wouldn't retreat. That man didn't live for the badge. He lived to correct the silence it had forced on him in his early years. He wouldn't fold now, not after everything. But Brooklyn also knew that this time personal integrity wouldn't be enough. She couldn't rely solely on the strength of those around her. She needed something stronger, a truth not just felt, but documented, structured, defensible, able to stand up against a legal language designed to bend toward the powerful. She opened her laptop, navigated to a private folder she had quietly built over the years. Inside were dozens of internal reports, most of them dismissed, many stamped with insufficient basis for conclusion. They detailed officers stopping cars without cause, recording ID checks on the flimsiest pretexts, and citizen complaints about being followed, questioned, or cornered simply for their clothes or their zip code. This wasn't just a folder, this was evidence. Line by line, case by case, report by report, Brooklyn began to organize, code, and sort. She didn't just name Travis, she listed every officer who had ever accidentally forgotten to check camera footage, who had filed nothing after blocking a civilian's path, and who claimed nothing seemed off during incidents tinged with bias. In the margins of each document, she handwrote notes, reminders of where fellow officers had spoken up and were quietly reassigned, of witness statements that were later withdrawn under pressure for the sake of departmental reputation. In a separate folder, she started building the file for Myrta's daughter, the case that had never been recorded, never formally acknowledged. Though there were no cameras, no reports, no paper trail, the way Myrta remembered every detail, down to the time, the location, the officer's name, left no doubt in Brooklyn's mind. She reached out to an old colleague in the civilian unit and asked him to scan 911 call records from the East Park area around the date Myrta had described. And heartbreakingly, they found it. A recording, barely audible at first, of a young girl's voice, breathless, pleading, "They're dragging me into the street. I didn't do anything." No one had followed up on it, but Brooklyn wouldn't let it go. She transcribed Myrta's testimony, word for word, layering it with a psychological analysis of trauma response in minors, demonstrating signs of prolonged distress, indirect emotional harm, and the conclusion that the girl's death was not a tragic accident, but the result of humiliation enabled and protected by a uniform. Then she pulled together similar cases, white officers confronting black youth, ending not in discipline but quiet transfers. Those stories had been buried. Now she laid them side by side, like pieces of a larger truth. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern, a rotting structure, and Brooklyn had no intention of knocking politely anymore. Near midnight, she uploaded the complete file to the encrypted internal system, but she also printed a hard copy, bound it tightly, and mailed it directly to 3 independent oversight boards, some of the last places in the system where people hadn't yet been numbed by power or paralyzed by fear. The next morning, Diana stopped by Brooklyn's home, holding 2 coffees and a summary of the initial hearing transcript. Before she could sit, Brooklyn handed her a binder nearly 100 pages thick, marked in red, for record, not for silence. Diana flipped through it quickly, her eyes widening with every page. "I've never seen an internal case file built like this. Where did you even get all of this?" Brooklyn didn't look up. She took a sip of coffee, now cold, from people no one ever listens to. You're going public? If they push me back, I will. If they sue, I'll countersue. And if they keep saying I've damaged the image of this department." She finally looked up, eyes glowing, not with anger, but with clarity, forged from too many years of being forced to swallow her voice. "Then I'll show them just how much damage that image has already done. To how many people, for how long, because of men like Travis Beck." In the days that followed, Brooklyn remained invisible to the public eye. No press conferences, no official remarks, not a single reaction on social media. Yet her silence was far from stillness. Beneath that quiet exterior unfolded a meticulous, cold, and uncompromising investigation, more exacting than any SWAT operation she had ever commanded. This wasn't a matter of vengeance. It was structure, strategy, and a search for rot that had taken root far deeper than anyone outside the system could imagine. The documents she had compiled, the testimonies, footage, and internal notes, were merely the visible tip of a submerged mass. Without intervention, it would remain hidden beneath polite bureaucracy and closed-door whispers, slow suffocation, endured by those pushed to the margins without a single question asked. But as she sifted through hundreds of reports that once seemed isolated and disconnected, a name began to surface, initially faint, almost dismissible, but with every page it grew clearer. White Order Watch. The name itself sounded innocuous, even bureaucratic. Marketed as an internal group for maintaining behavioral standards among officers, it had appeared in an internal newsletter 3 years ago with little fanfare. However, as Brooklyn began to connect the dots between those the group had quietly shielded from the investigation, a chilling pattern took shape. Nearly all were white officers with histories of abuse, excessive force, or racially motivated misconduct, and yet all had walked away unscathed, their records clean, their authority intact. Travis Beck was not the exception, he was one of many. Among the names were ghosts from Brooklyn's professional past, men whose faces she had tried to forget, a captain who once humiliated her in a briefing, dismissing her input as too sharp and combative, a lieutenant who had casually advised her to consider changing her name if she ever wanted a real shot at promotion, and a senior officer who, on her first week in uniform, had looked her in the eyes and told her plainly, "You'll have to be twice as good as everyone else here, and no one's going to applaud you for it." All of them had been reported. All of their cases had mysteriously been shelved, and all had kept their positions, or worse, risen higher. Diana, reviewing the pattern alongside Brooklyn, was the first to say aloud what they both already suspected. This was no longer a coincidence. "I remember that name," she said one afternoon. "When I got promoted to senior staff, they invited me to a leadership seminar, said it was about preserving departmental identity, but all it turned out to be was a room full of old white men reminiscing about the good old days when officers could make judgment calls on the spot without worrying about cameras or lawsuits." I walked out halfway through. It felt like stepping into a relic and a warning. Brooklyn didn't record the story. Instead, she opened a new file titled White Order Watch, Major Structure and Influence. With each new connection, each new hidden link, she marked the margins in bold red ink, annotations that felt less like analysis and more like the drafting of an indictment. What enraged her most wasn't simply the existence of the group, it was how openly, how comfortably, it operated within the heart of the department. There was no attempt to conceal its influence, because those within it believed, perhaps rightly, that no one would ever have the courage or power to challenge them. Travis had been protected by them for years. His career should have ended with the Eden Street incident, where his recklessness nearly cost a team member's life. But with the intervention of White Order Watch, the incident report was quietly rewritten, transforming a clear breach of protocol into a sanitized justification, a high-stress lapse in judgment. Not only did Travis remain employed, he was transferred to a quieter precinct where he repeated the same patterns, preying on people of color with impunity as if his record had been wiped clean. Brooklyn didn't send what she had found to the press. She didn't leak it online. She didn't submit anonymous tips to news outlets. Instead, she built her next move from within, knowing that exposing this too soon would only give them time to erase files, rewrite narratives, and use their mastery of legal language to flip the script, making her the aggressor, the problem, the disruptor of order. She quietly contacted 3 trusted colleagues, Black officers who, like her, had felt the weight of White Order Watch bearing down. There was an internal affairs analyst who had been pressured to dismiss certain cases, a former academy instructor who had been forced into early retirement for not aligning with departmental culture, and an ex-SWAT operator who had walked away from the badge because, as he put it, "There's no oxygen left for people like us." Together, they met in hushed cafes, exchanged encrypted notes, and pored over records only someone who had lived the culture could understand or decode. Diana didn't try to stop her. She simply said one thing: "If you're going down this road, don't do it to win. Do it to pull the rot out by the root." Brooklyn nodded. She wasn't interested in spectacle. She wasn't chasing headlines or symbolic victories. What she wanted was clarity, justice, not for applause, but for the people who had been erased, ignored, or coerced into silence. She aimed to pull the foundation stones from beneath the quiet power structures, not with outrage but with proof, targeted, undeniable, and irreversible. She drafted a formal request for a state-level special investigation, submitting it not under her name but through a collective declaration signed by 7 individuals who had been directly impacted by the group's reach. Among them was Mirta Jean, the very first to give her story a voice after years of being told to keep it buried. The proposal began with only 2 lines. They claimed to uphold professional standards. But what standard allows an officer to call someone's daughter trash in the middle of the street? What standard allows a child to die in silence and no one is held responsible? At the bottom, Brooklyn signed without rank or title. Just one line: someone who once believed the system could fix itself. Not anymore. The room where the closed-door hearing took place was not large, but it was saturated with a particular kind of silence. Not the calm of attentive listening, but the guarded quiet of a system being forced to look at itself. Heavy curtains covered the windows, and the lighting was dimmed just enough to prevent faces around the table from being too exposed, yet not so dark as to allow anyone to hide. This was not a space for public sympathy, nor a stage for those seeking glory. It was a battlefield for truth, and in this space, only evidence could speak. Brooklyn arrived precisely on time, walking in without haste, without needing to wear the armor of defiance. She carried a slim leather case, and inside it were hours of audio recordings, surveillance footage, validated testimonies, copies of ignored reports, and dossiers detailing cases that had been buried by the very individuals now seated across from her at the hearing table. There were no reporters, no cameras, only dark-suited figures with small nameplates in front of them, the same people who had previously signed off on internal resolutions that were never meant to see the light of day. Brooklyn offered no opening statement. Instead, she began to present methodically, unflinchingly. Each document she placed on the table came with a timestamp, a location, and a name. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. There was no anger, no plea, only numbers, patterns too precise to dismiss, and conclusions once marked as closed that now stood cracked and exposed under scrutiny. The video footage from the jewelry store was played again, this time for the full board to see. In it, Brooklyn stood motionless as she was accused, while Travis made a call to dispatch without cause or protocol. That was only the beginning. More files followed, more faces, more stories. And then, a moment that no one in the room had anticipated, a witness stepped forward to speak for her. Kyle Benson, a white SWAT officer who had served under Brooklyn during a high-risk hostage rescue mission in 2020, approached the witness stand. Dressed in plain clothes, calm in posture, but unwavering in his gaze, he looked directly at the panel, the very people who had remained silent for far too long. His voice was steady, quiet, and absent of drama. I served under her command. She wasn't just good, she was disciplined to the point of being terrifying, fair, to a fault. And when I saw what was being done to her, how people were trying to make her the problem, I realized that if I stayed quiet, then I was the problem. No one objected, no one cross-examined, because the video that followed of Kyle confronting Travis during a racially biased street stop the year before left no room for interpretation. His actions, his words, and his integrity had been caught on camera, and so had Travis's. Brooklyn didn't show emotion. She nodded, just once, then turned to the members of the board. For the first time since the hearing began, she spoke, not to defend herself, but to ask a question. Where is the justice America claims to uphold? No one responded. We write about it in textbooks, we swear oaths to it at graduation, we recite its name at press conferences, but when black civilians, or even black officers, are treated as inherent threats, where is it then? She paused, letting the silence stretch. Her eyes moved deliberately from one face to another. If someone like me, who has bled, sweated, and nearly died in service of this department, can be publicly accused, quietly isolated, and almost erased by the very system I once swore to protect, then who among us has any real chance at defending their most basic rights? From the left side of the room, someone exhaled sharply. No one interrupted. No one leaned into the safety of pre-scripted answers, because what now stood before them wasn't an unfortunate misunderstanding. What stood before them was a repeatable, documented structure, a decaying system, still calling itself order. Brooklyn wasn't there to win. She knew no speech and no footage would bring down a system in a single day. But the silence in that room, the kind that once served as armor for cover-ups, was now a crack in the facade. And for the first time, that silence was not one of control, but of discomfort. The fracture had begun. And this time it wasn't provoked by rage or protest. It was brought about by facts, undeniable, unvarnished, laid bare in front of those who had believed themselves untouchable. The room where the closed-door hearing took place was not large, but it was saturated with a particular kind of silence, not the calm of attentive listening, but the guarded quiet of a system being forced to look at itself. Heavy curtains covered the windows, and the lighting was dimmed just enough to prevent faces around the table from being too exposed, yet not so dark as to allow anyone to hide. This was not a space for public sympathy, nor a stage for those seeking glory. It was a battlefield for truth, and in this space, only evidence could speak. Brooklyn arrived precisely on time, walking in without haste, without needing to wear the armor of defiance. She carried a slim leather case, and inside it were hours of audio recordings, surveillance footage, validated testimonies, copies of ignored reports, and dossiers detailing cases that had been buried by the very individuals now seated across from her at the hearing table. There were no reporters, no cameras, only dark-suited figures with small nameplates in front of them, the same people who had previously signed off on internal resolutions that were never meant to see the light of day. Brooklyn offered no opening statement. Instead, she began to present methodically, unflinchingly. Each document she placed on the table came with a time stamp, a location, and a name. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. There was no anger, no plea, only numbers, patterns too precise to dismiss, and conclusions once marked as closed that now stood cracked and exposed under scrutiny. The video footage from the jewelry store was played again, this time for the full board to see. In it, Brooklyn stood motionless as she was accused, while Travis made a call to dispatch without cause or protocol. That was only the beginning. More files followed, more faces, more stories. And then, a moment that no one in the room had anticipated, a witness stepped forward to speak for her. Kyle Benson, a white SWAT officer who had served under Brooklyn during a high-risk hostage rescue mission in 2020, approached the witness stand. Dressed in plain clothes, calm in posture, but unwavering in his gaze, he looked directly at the panel, the very people who had remained silent for far too long. His voice was steady, quiet, and absent of drama. I served under her command. She wasn't just good. She was disciplined to the point of being terrifying, fair to a fault, and when I saw what was being done to her, how people were trying to make her the problem, I realized that if I stayed quiet, then I was the problem. No one objected, no one cross-examined, because the video that followed, of Kyle confronting Travis during a racially biased street stop the year before, left no room for interpretation. His actions, his words, and his integrity had been caught on camera, and so had Travis's. Brooklyn didn't show emotion. She nodded, just once, then turned to the members of the board. For the first time since the hearing began, she spoke, not to defend herself, but to ask a question. Where is the justice America claims to uphold? No one responded. We write about it in textbooks, we swear oaths to it at graduation, we recite its name at press conferences. But when black civilians, or even black officers, are treated as inherent threats, where is it then? She paused, letting the silence stretch. Her eyes moved deliberately from one face to another. If someone like me, who has bled, sweated, and nearly died in service of this department, can be publicly accused, quietly isolated, and almost erased by the very system I once swore to protect, then who among us has any real chance at defending their most basic rights? From the left side of the room, someone exhaled sharply. No one interrupted. No one leaned into the safety of pre-scripted answers, because what now stood before them wasn't an unfortunate misunderstanding. What stood before them was a repeatable, documented structure, a decaying system, still calling itself order. Brooklyn wasn't there to win. She knew no speech and no footage would bring down a system in a single day, but the silence in that room, the kind that once served as armor for cover-ups, was now a crack in the facade, and for the first time, that silence was not one of control, but of discomfort. The fracture had begun, and this time it wasn't provoked by rage or protest. It was brought about by facts, undeniable, unvarnished, laid bare in front of those who had believed themselves untouchable. The hearing ended without applause, without camera flashes, and without any celebratory embrace. Brooklyn walked out of that room in a silence more powerful than any words, because when truth is finally spoken, there is often nothing left to say. But outside those walls, the world had already begun to shift. Within a week, the layers once wrapped tightly around the institution, uniforms, procedure, silence, began to peel away, one name at a time, one case, one failure, until the unraveling of a structure once thought untouchable became undeniable. Travis Beck's name first appeared on internal bulletins, then quickly spread across public headlines. Former officer charged with abuse of authority, false accusation, and verbal assault, resulting in psychological harm. But what stunned many wasn't just the list of charges. It was the case buried 3 years prior, now resurrected and named for what it had always been, the public shaming and institutional abandonment of a teenage girl who later took her own life, Myrta Jean's daughter. Brooklyn had refused to let that story remain a quiet tragedy swept beneath the city's stone floors. She worked with civilian investigators, retrieved call records from dispatch, found witnesses who had once stayed silent out of fear, and, most importantly, she put that story on legal record, framing it as what it truly was, the consequence of unchecked power disguised as protocol. In court, Travis lowered his head, not in remorse, but because for the first time he had nowhere left to hide. His lawyer could no longer claim there was insufficient evidence, the 911 recording, Myrta's testimony, the medical reports, the consistent statements from 2 eyewitnesses. It all matched. This time, it was inescapable. He was not just stripped of his badge, he was convicted. 3 years in prison for abuse of authority resulting in psychological harm to a minor, 2 years of probation, most significantly, a civil ruling that required him to pay full restitution for medical expenses, long-term damages, and a financial settlement to Myrta, mandated not as charity, but as a condition of justice. No sentence could bring her daughter back, but for the first time the system acknowledged, officially, that even a poor, undocumented black woman had the right to be heard and to be apologized to. And then came the bigger reckoning. White Order Watch, once dismissed as an internal rumor, was now cited by name in federal policy meetings. The investigative report submitted by Brooklyn and her allies was officially approved for special review. Within just 4 weeks, a 60-page list was released, naming every officer who had been protected by the group. More than half had faced prior complaints of racial profiling or unnecessary use of force. Each name was accompanied by a status update, demotion, formal reprimand, termination, or in severe cases, criminal charges. A few officers opted for early retirement, believing they could slip out quietly. But this time, even those retirement files were reviewed. Then came something the department had never seen before. The U.S. Department of Justice passed legislation requiring law enforcement agencies to publicly disclose internal disciplinary records, especially those involving racial misconduct. Americans no longer had to imagine what justice looked like. They could see it. They could read the names. They could view the clips, the reports, the testimonies, documents that had once been buried beneath layers of classified internal matters. People who had once been forced to bow their heads believing their lives held no institutional value were now receiving letters of acknowledgement, financial redress, or at the very least, having their names returned to history as part of a system trying, finally, to correct itself. A machine once built to preserve a white order had fallen, not by riot, not by fire, but by facts, by patterns, by paper trails, by the cold, sharp edges of truth that needed no amplification. Brooklyn never stood in a town square to declare victory. She didn't appear on television. When someone invited her to speak publicly, she simply said, "I don't need them to remember my name. I need them to remember that even the forgotten can still change everything." And that afternoon, when Myrta Jean walked out of the courthouse, holding the stamped judgment in her hand, she didn't cry. There were no tears left. She simply turned to Brooklyn and said, softly, "My daughter didn't die for nothing." Brooklyn nodded, her gaze drifting toward the horizon, where the late sun burned gold across the sky. A quiet reminder that even the most immovable structures can crumble, as long as someone is willing to reach for them with truth. And it wasn't only the officers who faced consequences for their roles in the system's failure. Lori Whitmore, the white woman who had fabricated her accusation, live-streamed Brooklyn's humiliation and triggered the chain of events with a lie, was not spared. With video evidence, store footage, and witness accounts, she was formally charged with false reporting, defamation, and inciting public interference with law enforcement protocol. She faced a substantial civil penalty, was ordered to issue a public apology, and was banned from initiating any legal complaint against law enforcement personnel for 5 years. Her social accounts went silent. Her name, once spoken with authority, now carried the weight of a public reminder. Silence does not protect you when the truth is recorded. Justice didn't roar. It didn't explode. It simply arrived, documented, deliberate, and unstoppable. Lori Whitmore had once been a name that echoed across every platform. With over 2 million followers, she wasn't just a fashion influencer. She was a symbol of the modern lifestyle. Polished, articulate, effortlessly curated, with luxury getaways and aesthetic routines punctuated by moral lessons on confidence and compassion. In her posts, she often declared her support for equality, writing lines like, Everyone deserves to be heard. But all those words dissolved like sea foam the moment she realized, too late, that someone had been listening. When Lori's live stream from the jewelry store resurfaced, this time not posted by her but by an anonymous shopper who had recorded the scene from behind, paired with security footage later shown during Brooklyn's hearing, the internet erupted. The clip of Lori saying, "I know people like her," her voice sharp, her eyes dripping with disdain as they landed on Brooklyn, was now looped, slowed down, and dissected word by word. No one called it a slip of the tongue anymore. They called it what it was: racism. Within 48 hours, the story dominated social media feeds on both X and Instagram. The outrage spread far beyond the United States. Longtime fans from the UK, South Korea, Brazil, and Nigeria reposted the clip with a unified message: "Lori, we saw, and we don't forget." Brands that once partnered with her cut ties by the end of the day. Sponsored content disappeared from her feed. A magazine that had featured her on the cover pulled the issue from its archive and replaced it with a full-length editorial titled "The Hypocrisy of the Influencer Class." At first, Lori remained silent. Then she posted a 30-second story apologizing if my words were misunderstood and claiming she never intended to offend anyone. But no one accepted it, because the apology didn't come from accountability, only from the fear of losing power. She never admitted wrongdoing. She never said Brooklyn's name. She never faced what she had done. The internet didn't forgive. A week later, Lori's Instagram and YouTube accounts vanished without a trace. The people who had once worked with her went silent too, unwilling to be associated with a name now synonymous with privilege, wrapped in polished, performative virtue. Brooklyn said nothing. She never mentioned Lori by name in interviews, in writing, or passing. She didn't need to. To Brooklyn, justice wasn't about revenge. It was about correction. And when a system begins to collapse, it doesn't just take down those who stood at the center. It pulls with it the bystanders too, the ones who stayed quiet, the ones who cloaked their complicity in style and smile. In the rising tide of those who had found their voice, Lori Whitmore, the woman who once walked confidently beneath the glow of a digital spotlight, was swallowed by the one light that couldn't be curated: truth. No one asked where she had gone. No one needed to, because she had chosen to disappear the moment she could no longer play the role the world once mistook for integrity. The aftershocks of courtrooms, verdicts, and a system's collapse lasted longer than the headlines. They seeped into neighborhoods, into classrooms, into dinner tables where black families sat together in silence, not to celebrate but simply to breathe. For the first time, they had seen one of their own not only survive the system, but make the system stop, look back, and reckon with itself. In another corner of the city, far from the government buildings and thick-curtained boardrooms, a teenager named Jaden Coleman sat in a small room barely larger than a holding cell, watching a replay of Brooklyn's testimony before the oversight board. The laptop on his lap was old, the lighting harsh, but his eyes, sharp, unblinking, reflected every word on the screen. In that room, Jaden had never felt more seen. Brooklyn's voice rang out, not trembling, not shouting, not begging for grace, but reminding a nation that the right to be respected should never be conditional. Jaden was 17. His mother worked 2 jobs. His father left when he was 4. He attended a high school no one remembered, the kind where the day often ended with sirens outside or fists pounding classroom doors. He had been stopped while walking home because he matched a vague description. He had watched his best friend get arrested for asking a white officer why they were checked every day, while those in suits walked by untouched. Jaden used to believe he would never leave his corner of the map. Then he saw Brooklyn. Not because she was a SWAT commander, not because she won a hearing, but because in a world full of bowed heads, she stood up straight. She didn't flinch. She didn't beg for leniency. She didn't perform palatability in exchange for mercy. She was fully herself, and the system had to reshape itself because she refused to be reshaped. One afternoon, Jaden walked into the local police precinct wearing a worn-out t-shirt and a pair of sneakers with split soles. The officer at the reception desk eyed him slowly, reflexes still locked in old habits. But Jaden stood tall and said clearly, "I want to apply for the SWAT internship program. Brooklyn Hayes is the reason I'm here." The message reached headquarters. 3 days later, Brooklyn saw his file on her desk, with a handwritten note from Diana. "You might want to meet this kid." They met in a quiet lounge at the SWAT training center. Jaden didn't speak much, but his eyes carried a rare intensity, something no textbook could teach and no test could measure. He didn't have great grades. He didn't go to a magnet school. He didn't know how to craft a polished essay explaining why I wanted to be an officer, but he looked Brooklyn in the eye and said, "I don't think I'll ever be like you, but I want to learn how not to bow my head, like you didn't." Brooklyn didn't answer right away. She looked at Jaden, as if seeing a rougher version of her younger self, not shaped by scholarships or praise, but by all the times she had to swallow her voice, just to avoid being labeled a problem. She understood exactly where he came from. The American education system had never truly been fair, especially not for black kids raised in low-income neighborhoods, where schools existed more in form than in function, where books were outdated, teachers rotated out every semester, and expectations were so low that simply showing up on time felt like an achievement. Kids like Jaden grew up where education was underfunded, and that lack of investment showed. With fewer job opportunities, lower income, and parents struggling just to survive, their children often grew up without guidance or structure. This kind of absence didn't just cheapen meals, it blurred self-worth. When you've never been taught that you matter, you begin to believe you're just a shadow in society, and from that vacuum violence thrives, in homes, on streets, and worst of all, from those who are supposed to protect order. When conflict erupts, the police often don't arrive to de-escalate, they arrive to dominate. And kids like Jaden, already left behind from the start, get swept up in the churn, accused, detained, pulled from classrooms, and labeled for behavioral intervention. But removing a child from school isn't correction. It's a quiet sentence, one that throws them back to square one, now with a record attached. And so the loop repeats, from poor education to low income, from poverty to violence, from violence to incarceration, and back again. Life becoming a noose disguised by the neat phrase, personal responsibility. But Brooklyn didn't see a poor kid. She saw a spark, and if left untended, it would burn out, not because it lacked heat, but because no one ever bothered to look at it long enough to help it burn. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Jaden, not as a commander embracing a recruit, but as someone who understood. Real change doesn't come from toppling towers. It comes from refusing to bow where the world expects you to. She whispered, "You don't have to be like me. Just don't bow your head the way they want you to." Jaden didn't cry. He nodded, and in that small, quiet nod, Brooklyn knew his road ahead would be hard. He would be judged, tested, and maybe even humiliated. But now he had seen someone who had walked through all of it and never fell. And sometimes, just one person seeing is enough to begin a wave the system can't predict. On an early Monday morning, sunlight softened across the glass exterior of Marlowe and Finn, the luxury jewelry store that had once served as the stage for one of the most public racial confrontations ever captured and shared online. But today, the light didn't just reflect off gold and diamonds. It quietly fell upon the faces of a solemn row of people gathered in the store's main lobby. From sales associates to cashiers, security staff to stockroom workers, everyone was present. No one spoke. No one met each other's eyes. Every gaze was focused on a single person, and a newly mounted wooden plaque beside the front counter. Brooklyn Hayes stepped into the space with a calm, upright posture. Her stride was unhurried, her presence firm. She knew what this place had once represented for her, the starting point of a chain of events where she had been publicly humiliated, unjustly accused by a police officer, and viewed with suspicion simply because of her skin color and a plain gray hoodie. But today, she wasn't here to revisit that pain. She was here to witness something rare, a place that had once chosen silence, now choosing to speak to truth. Howard Langley, the store's owner, stood at the front of the room, his hands clasped tightly as if steadying his voice. Nearing 60, he'd weathered economic downturns, rising competition, and shifts in consumer trends. But perhaps never had he felt a weight as personal as the one that settled on him in the days following Brooklyn's incident. He hadn't insulted her directly. He hadn't accused her, but he had stood on the sidelines and had allowed his staff and clientele to act on prejudice unchecked. He had let a black woman stand alone under a cloud of humiliation while he looked the other way. And that silence, more than any spoken word, was what he now felt most compelled to confront. Langley didn't read from notes. He didn't justify his inaction. He simply spoke the truths that had kept him up at night. He apologized to Brooklyn, not just for the way she was treated, but for his failure to intervene, to lead, to remind those under his roof that ethics should guide behavior, not habit. He apologized for the silence that day, for how many people learned to turn away instead of speak up, and for the fact that it had been his silence that allowed it to happen. Brooklyn listened. She didn't soften. She didn't grandstand. Her eyes scanned the room, pausing on each face. The blonde associate who had looked away. The security guard would still like furniture. The cashier who had fumbled for words and then said nothing. They were all here today. No one is absent. And that, more than anything else, made her believe this wasn't a performance. It was a change. After his statement, Langley walked to the front counter and, with the help of a young employee, lifted a newly carved wooden plaque into place. The lettering wasn't ornate, but it didn't need to be. What it said carried more than any logo or slogan the store had ever hung. Here we once stayed silent. Now we stand for truth. The words weren't decoration. They were reminders. For those who had turned away and for those who would enter this space in the future, carrying the weight of being seen as out of place simply by how they look. Brooklyn didn't make a speech. She didn't ask for applause. When Langley offered her the floor, she simply stepped forward, placed her hand gently on the plaque for a beat, and looked him in the eye. The silence that followed said everything. She acknowledged it. She wasn't offering forgiveness. She wasn't erasing the past, but she saw this act, and she marked it. For those truly remorseful, sometimes that's enough. A few days later, a company-wide memo went out across the entire Marlowe & Finn retail network. Lori Whitmore was officially banned for life from entering any affiliated store. The reason, documented in the formal record, read, racially discriminatory conduct, public defamation of a customer, and breach of public ethics. No one objected. Not a single voice rose in her defense. Lori, once featured in glossy campaigns as the face of modern elegance, had become a name no one wanted to mention. Since the day of the incident, she had never reappeared. She didn't accept the apology. She didn't call. She didn't write. She never once offered an explanation or an expression of remorse. But that no longer mattered. Her silence now was no longer a tool of image control. It was a consequence, and that consequence had locked the very doors she used to walk through with pride, now sealed by her arrogance. Brooklyn left the store that day as an ordinary person, no security detail, no entourage, but everyone who saw her knew she hadn't left as a customer. She had walked away as someone who had forced this place to confront its conscience and change. No spotlight followed her exit. But in every pane of glass she passed, each one now cleaned and polished to reflect beauty, the reflection looking back wasn't just Brooklyn haze. It was a place that had finally become more than a luxury storefront. It was now a space that kept a promise to truth. The suburban afternoon drifted by in silence, as if every sound had stepped aside to make space for things that could not be spoken aloud. Brooklyn had just left Marlowe & Finn, the sunlight catching her windshield in broken fragments like shattered mirrors. each shard reflecting the layered emotions of a long, heavy day. She didn't turn on the radio. She didn't immediately drive off. Instead, she sat still in the parked car, one hand resting gently on the steering wheel, her gaze unfocused on the trees swaying just beyond the glass. On the passenger seat lay a plain brown envelope, delivered through the department's central inbox. The recipient was printed clearly, Commander Brooklyn Hayes. The sender was a name she didn't recognize, Monica Elridge. No title, no subject line, just a name, handwritten in ink that trembled slightly, as if every letter had been formed with quiet hesitation. Brooklyn opened the envelope with her fingertips, slowly, as if afraid to tear something more fragile than paper. Inside was a letter, handwritten, black ink. The cursive was slanted and uneven, the kind of writing that could only come from someone trying to hold steady while their heart broke. She read the first few lines, and already her breath began to slow. Monica Elridge was the mother of Devin Elridge, a black teenager who had been arrested 2 years earlier by Travis Beck in a case that left behind no evidence. Devin had just turned 16. He was walking home from school when he was stopped for suspicious behavior. There was no video footage, no witnesses were willing to come forward. The report filed by Travis claimed Devin had been aggressive in response. The boy was held for 2 nights. No guardian was present, no lawyer, and though Devin was eventually released, he never came back the same. Monica wrote that, from that day forward, her son had grown silent, withdrawn, sleepless. He fell into a deep depression, dropped out of school, and only months later, on a night no one was watching, Devon ended his life with a rope in the shed behind their home. Brooklyn sat frozen in the driver's seat, fingers tightening around the edge of the letter, each word pressing down on her chest like an invisible weight. But Monica didn't write with anger. She didn't assign blame. The final lines of her letter floated, devastatingly quiet. If my son were alive, he would have called you a hero, not because you fought, but because you survived, the way he tried to, but couldn't. Nothing in Brooklyn's years of service, from hostage rescues and rooftop foot pursuits under fire to tense, closed-door meetings with high-ranking brass, could have prepared her for this letter. Devin wasn't the first. But something about Monica's words, the way she chose not to scream or accuse but simply to bear witness, cracked through the armor Brooklyn had carried for so long. Along the road she had traveled, there had been too many names forgotten, too many stories never told, too many black people who didn't have a badge to flash when suspicion came knocking. Nobody came to protect them, no public hearing to rewrite their story, and so they disappeared, silently, as if they'd never existed. She thought of Monica, this woman who had lost her child and still found the strength to write to a stranger, not to demand anything, just to say, "Thank you for surviving." That kind of grace undid something in Brooklyn, because she too had once thought she wouldn't make it through, had once wondered if she could hold on to her humanity in a place where surviving itself was a daily act of resistance. But she had made it, and now, here she was, sitting in her car, holding a letter from someone who had nothing left but a flickering belief in the living. In that cramped, quiet space, as daylight began to fold itself into dusk, Brooklyn saw more clearly than ever what no report, no ruling, no speech could express. Justice isn't just an outcome. It's a chain of choices. It's refusing to look away when harm is happening. It's choosing to carry the names of those who were lost, not as data points, but as lives. She didn't know if she deserved to be called a hero, as Monica had written, but she knew one thing for certain. This letter would not be stored away as a memory. Devin would not be filed under collateral damage. His name would appear in the final report Brooklyn was preparing for the Department of Justice, not simply as a victim, but as a reminder that behind every stop and frisk, every sidelong glance, every sanitized report, there was someone who tried to survive. She closed her eyes for a few seconds, letting herself feel a pain that wasn't hers. but lived inside her now. When she opened them, she folded the letter carefully, placed it back on the passenger seat, and finally turned the ignition. The engine hummed quietly, and the car pulled away slowly from the lot. Outside, the sky had shifted to a muted orange, as if even the sunset bowed its head in acknowledgement of truth just spoken aloud. Not everyone is lucky enough to survive, and that's exactly why those who do must live with a greater purpose. When Brooklyn pulled into the staff parking lot of the training center, the sky had already surrendered to dusk. Tall lampposts cast a warm golden glow across the pavement, their light stretching into quiet streaks on the ground as if the entire building had slowed its breath, waiting for her return. The atmosphere felt different than usual. No laughter echoed from the break room. No boots stomping hurriedly down the hallway. Everything was still. Not tense, but intentionally calm, as if someone had cleared a space in the world just for this moment. She stepped out of the car, the door closing gently behind her. In her hand, she still carried Monica Elridge's letter, not as a keepsake, but as a quiet reminder. With each step she took toward the center's glass entrance, she shed the layers of who she had been over the past weeks. The defendant, the witness, the symbol of injustice, and reclaimed another part of herself, the teammate, the commander, the woman whose presence inside this building had once meant courage under fire and trust built on blood and grit. And then the doors opened, and she stopped, right there, in the center of the main lobby, normally a mess of boots, backpacks, banter, and late-night caffeine, stood her entire SWAT unit, lined up in full training uniform, boots polished to a mirror shine, tactical caps tucked under arms, every gaze focused squarely on her. No one barked an order, no one raised a hand. As if moved by one unspoken understanding, the entire team lifted their right arms in a formal salute, a gesture not reserved for rank, but for those who'd earned unwavering trust. A gesture that said, "We see who you are, not what they said you were." Brooklyn stood motionless for a few seconds. Her heart didn't pound from emotion, it simply went quiet, as if every scar she carried had, for the first time, found a place to rest. The respect in their eyes wasn't because of the badge on her chest, it was because she had never used it as a shield. She had never asked for favors. She had never left anyone behind, whether in gunfire or behind closed doors. She stepped forward. Every footfall was a statement. I walked through the fire, and I did not bend. As she approached, the team lowered their hands, their eyes still fixed on her, pride written on every face. Captain Mason Ricks stepped out from the front row, crisp in uniform as always. His eyes were sharp, steady, the eyes of someone who had seen too much and respected those who'd survived anyway. He gave a single nod, then asked, voice low, steady, "You okay?" Brooklyn gave a small, sideways smile, just enough to loosen the weight of the moment. "I've had worse days." A soft ripple of laughter followed. It wasn't loud. It didn't break the solemnity. It just made space for everyone to exhale. From the side, Diana walked over, arms loosely folded, eyes shining with a pride that had been building for years. Once a mentor, then a peer, now a believer, she had never stopped betting on the woman who now stood before her. "I'd vote you sheriff if I could," Diana said dryly. Brooklyn raised a brow, the corner of her mouth lifting with subtle amusement, though the emotion beneath still swirled. "Wait till I retire." It landed like a joke, but they all knew the truth beneath it. Her position, her place, wasn't something handed down. It had been carved out through bruises, courtroom silence, and the kind of endurance no training manual could ever teach. She scanned the line of faces, every one of them familiar, everyone tied to memory. Cold night stakeouts, drills in pouring rain, missions where one misstep meant no one came home. They'd survived not because they were the best, but because they believed in one another. And today, her presence needed no explanation. They were simply there to say, "You still belong here." A younger officer stepped forward quietly from the end of the line and handed Brooklyn a folder. Just a plain application form, recently approved. The name on it is Jaden Coleman. Brooklyn smiled, nodded once, and then tucked the file into her jacket pocket. The fight she had waged didn't end in court. It would continue inside every recruit who dared to believe the force could be better. She turned to Mason, this time her tone grounded, certain. We can't rewrite the past, but we can train the future better. He nodded, and for a second the hardness in his face softened, just enough to let her see that he understood. And in that moment, Brooklyn realized something. Justice doesn't live only in verdicts or press conferences. It lives in eyes like these, in the quiet recognition from those who still believe, in the way they stood when they saluted her, in the kind of respect that needs no ceremony. She didn't need all of America to love her. She just needed America to listen. A wounded country could still heal if it learned to honor those it had wounded first. Standing in the center of that circle, Brooklyn wasn't a hero in lights. She was something harder to find and more enduring, a living witness that resilience can outlast prejudice. And in that moment, no one saw her for the color of her skin. They saw her for the woman she had become. Brooklyn Hayes never sought recognition. She simply chose to stand when too many had grown used to bowing. From a jewelry store steeped in quiet prejudice to the unforgiving spotlight of a formal hearing, she proved that justice is not a privilege, it is a right owed to everyone. And sometimes, one person who dares to say, "I will not back down," is enough to make an entire system reckon with itself. So let us ask you, what's harder, holding on to your belief when others doubt you, or choosing to forgive when you've been deeply wronged? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that speak to justice, humanity, and truth.